Okay, so with psychiatric problems are pose something of a puzzle for evolution. One of the things we know is that pretty much any mental illness you can think of has a certain level of heritability, meaning that there's a certain contribution of genes to the possibility that you would develop that disorder. This slide just shows some of the estimated concordance rates between monozygotic twins, identical twins, and dizygotic twins, who are non-identical twins. Monozygotic twins, remember, are genetically identical. They contain exactly the same genes. This because monozygotic twins started off as a single fertilized egg, would have normally become one person, but that fertilized egg split into two and became two people. So they're genetically identical. Dizygotic twins share 50% of their genes. They're genetically just like brother and sister, the result of two eggs being fertilized each by its own sperm, so just like brother and sister that happen to share the uterine environment. A concordance rate is just basically that if you find that one individual has a disorder, what is the likelihood that the co-twin will also have the disorder. So we can see here that because this is schizophrenia, because the monozygotic concordance rates is bigger than the concordance rates for dizygotic twins. This shows that there's some genetic effect, some genetic cause of schizophrenia. Now, it's not purely genetic. There is some combination of genes and environment here, but there is some level of heritability. Depression is even greater, 59%. If one identical twin has major depression, then the likelihood that the other identical twin has it is around about 59%. But for dizygotic twins, it's down to 18%. Autism, similar story, bipolar disorder, and even alcoholism. So the problem here is that if genes are a partial cause of a disorder, and if that disorder, for example, depression, reduces fitness, in other words, it makes you less likely to survive, less likely to have children, less likely to rear children to reproductive age, which we assume that things such serious disorders such as autism, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia and depression probably do reduce fitness, then why hasn't natural selection weeded those nasty genes out? Because if you like, genes for depression are less likely to find themselves in the next generation, because the people who have it are less likely to have children themselves, or at least bring them up or survive. So why isn't it eradicated? And that's the problem. There are a number of solutions as to what is keeping these disorders in the gene pool. Three of them here. One of them is heterozygous advantage, late onset, polygenism, and so-called time lag hypotheses. So let's explore what they are. Heterozygous advantage is an interesting thing. We know that for a particular gene, remember, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and those chromosomes are pairs because they can contain the same genes strung along them in any particular position. Now, if you have two copies of the same gene, let's say you have a gene for blue eyes on chromosome 1, whatever gene for eye colour, doesn't really matter, and a gene for blue eyes on chromosome 2, then on the other pair of chromosome 1, then you would have blue eyes. You would then be called homozygous because you have the same, homo means same, gene on each pair of the chromosome. On the other hand, you might have a blue gene on left-hand pair of chromosome 1, and you might have a brown-eyed gene on the right-hand pair of chromosome 1, in which case you would be called heterozygous. Because you have different genes, and hetero just means different, as in heterosexual. That's a preference for people of different sex. Homosexual, preference for people of the same sex. Now, in terms of genes can dominate each other. So if you've got a blue-eyed gene and a brown-eyed gene, because brown-eyed genes are dominant, you have brown eyes. Likewise, if you have two brown-eyed genes, if you're homozygous for brown, you'll have brown eyes. Only if you're homozygous for blue-eyed genes would you have blue eyes. Now, there is an argument of a thing called heterozygous advantage. People with one copy of a toxic gene may benefit from have a benefit from having that gene, whereas people who have two copies, people who are homozygous for that gene, or homozygotes, in other words, they have two copies of that toxic gene, they then suffer. And one example of this is a thing called sickle cell anemia. Now, this is something which affects people largely in Africa, or people of African descent. It's a genetic disorder, I'm putting disorder in quotation marks there because we'll ask whether this sickle cell genuinely is a disorder. People have two copies. They suffer, so if they're homozygous for this toxic sickle cell gene, they have weakness, general physical weakness, they have pain, suffer pain, bone pain, muscle pain, kidney damage, mental retardation. It's a horrible disease. People don't tend to last very long and has clear effects on fitness. They're less likely to reproduce, have children, bring kids up. So why could there be an advantage here? Well, here's an interesting graph. On the left-hand side, we have the concentration of sickle cell genes. The sickle cell allele. Allele is just a technical term for gene in this context. Sickle cell allele in Africa, and we can see that the distribution is largely through the kind of central regions of Africa. On the right-hand side is a picture of the distribution of a particular kind of malaria parasite called Malaria falciparum in Africa, and you can see that there's a strong correlation between the existence of sickle cell and malaria. So why might this be? This is just an illustration of if two people with, so R is the norm, big R is the normal gene, little r is the toxic gene, big R again normal gene, toxic gene. So these people are both heterozygous for the genes. They have a different copy on each of the chromosomes. And because the toxic gene is recessive, these would appear normal. They wouldn't have the disease, sickle cell disease. These individuals, if these two people had children, then the likelihood is that they would have one with big R, in other words, a homozygous for the normal gene, one, and then two of them would be big R, little r, which means they're heterozygous, and then the third person who's depicted red here would have little r, which means that they would have the disorder, they would have sickle cell. So there's a 1 in 4 chance that if two people who are heterozygous for the toxic gene, mum and dad here, if they have kids, there's a 1 in 4 chance that we'll have a kid with sickle cell. But you'll have a 2 in 4 chance that they will be like their parents, heterozygous for the disease. So what might the advantage be? Well, people, if they have the one copy of the gene, they don't suffer from sickle cell, but they do seem to have a certain immunity to malaria. So that the presence of one copy of that toxic gene doesn't cause any physical problems, doesn't cause a sickle cell disease, but it does give them immunity to malaria. And malaria is a massive killer in Africa. It's one of the biggest killers throughout the world. I think, second or third to kind of polluted water. Malaria is a huge killer in areas where malaria exists. So there's a massive benefit of having this immunity to malaria. And the argument here is that even though 1 in 4 children on average will suffer by having 2 copies of the toxic gene, the 2 in 4 that benefit from having the single copy of the toxic gene, the benefits that they get in terms of fitness, survival, reproduction, etc., by having an immunity to malaria outweighs the effect. So the sickle cell gene, continues in the population because of the advantages that having a single copy of that gene confers on individuals who have that gene. When somebody says, has a disease disorder, a genetic disorder, and says, why me? Why is this happening to me? The answer to the question is rather unfortunately, because that toxic gene, which is having such a nasty effect on you, is being kept in a population by the fact that it benefits other people. In other words, your misfortune is other people's misfortune. You're almost like kind of collateral damage of the good effect that these genes have in other people when they're paired with normal copies of the gene. So the fitness advantage of the gene of heterozygosity outweighs the fitness disadvantage when you are homozygous, because that gene is simply reproducing because it's having positive effects in other people who are then more likely to pass it on to to their kids, with the unfortunate collateral damage that some of their kids are going to suffer from getting the double whammy of having 2 copies of the toxic gene. So heterozygous advantage can be quite an important thing in terms of maintaining genes in a population, and we'll see a similar example of this later on when we talk about polygenism. Late onset is that many genetic disorders may affect the sufferer in late adulthood. So Huntington's chorea, which is a nasty disorder, this is a dominant gene which causes this. It doesn't affect people until later on, until they're in their 30s and 40s. Alzheimer's disease, which has some genetic contribution, doesn't have its onset until, in many cases, people in their 60s, although there are earlier forms, earlier onset Alzheimer's where people can get it in their 30s and 40s. The point of this is that these genes are kept in the population. They're not eradicated, because by the time the gene kicks in and has its toxic effects in terms of memory problems and movement problems, in terms of Huntington's chorea, the individual will have already reproduced and possibly even raised their children to the age at which their children are capable of living an independent life. So genetic disorders which have late onset can actually, if you like, fly beneath natural selection's radar, because although they have a consequence on fitness, the effect that they have on fitness is subsequent to the gene already being passed on in the children. So late onset is another way in which genes can be kept in a population despite having significant effects on fitness, as both of these disorders do. Polygenism is very similar to heterozygous advantage, except with heterozygous advantage it's a gene at a particular locus, or two alleles at a particular locus, as we saw with the sickle cell gene and the normal gene. But most disorders and most traits are not the result of a single gene, and abnormalities such as schizophrenia, depression, autism and so on are almost certainly the result of a number of genes all working together to cause that particular trait, whether that be something like intelligence or personality or some kind of disorder such as depression. It's not one single gene which is causing it. And then one way of thinking about this is to think about what sex is. The kind of whole idea about sex is, you imagine that sex is just basically a process of genetic shuffling. So we imagine that the male has, let's say, 20 cards, playing cards, and the female has 20 playing cards. And what happens is that the female simply cuts her deck in half, so she has half the number of genes. The male cuts his deck in half, so he's half the number of genes, and then they're combined to form an offspring who then has the full complement of 20 cards, or their genes. So that's basically what sex is. It's kind of, you shuffle your pack, you cut it in half, and then you put those together, and that's your offspring's genes. Now, one of the important points about this is that how good your hand of cards is, if you're an offspring, isn't just necessarily dependent upon the cards itself. It's dependent upon the combination of cards that you get. So if you're thinking of playing a game like poker, then of course in a game like poker, very probably an ace is a better card to have than, I don't know, a 2 or a 5. A picture card is probably better than a non-picture card. But more important than the actual quality of the cards, the actual values of the cards themselves, is the hand you've got. So if you're playing a game of poker and you've got 3 2s, then getting a 2 would be really good. So a 2 would be a great card in that context. If you've got a bunch of 3 5s, then a 2's not a good card, nor is an ace. So what matters isn't necessarily the absolute quality of the individual genes, it's how well the genes fit together. So we can imagine that when certain genes are inherited in the context of certain other genes, then that might produce intelligent, fit, healthy individuals. But if the certain combination of genes are inherited together, then that might kind of predispose individuals to developing certain psychiatric disorders. So it's kind of similar to psychiatric, the kind of heterozygous advantage idea, that it might be the case that a particular gene is kept in a population because when inherited with a certain set of other genes, it leads to people being, super intelligent or extremely sociable or very healthy. But if that particular gene is inherited with another combination of genes, it may lead to something like depression or anxiety or whatever, these kind of disorders. So that particular gene is kept in a population because in the presence of other genes, it leads to fitness benefits which outweigh the disadvantages as to when that gene is inherited in combination with other genes, which can lead to fitness, with negative fitness consequences. The time-lag hypothesis is quite important when looking at things like depression, which may have been that the abnormality may have been beneficial in our ancestral past, or it could have been the case that the environment has changed so that that gene which was once beneficial or at least neutral is now possibly harmful. So we see examples of things like, the ability to our kind of so-called diurnal sleep patterns, which mean that we awake during the